"I'm calling the police if that thing shows up one more time," Madison Hartwell screamed, nearly tripping over her designer heels as her crew of fake HOA enforcers fired up their industrial mower. For the fourth time that week. They weren't mowing grass, they were making a statement. Right through my wheat field. That morning, I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I opened the gate. What Madison didn't know was that something behind that gate really hates loud engine. But before we get into what happened next, let's rewind. Because this war didn't start with fences or fields. It started with ego. And if you've ever dealt with a petty HOA, you'll want to hear this. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This one's personal. My name is Levi Morrison. I was a soldier, got my agricultural engineering degree, and decided to work the land with my own two hands. 15 years ago, I bought 20 acres of prime farmland outside Springfield, back when it was just me, scattered neighbors, and endless golden fields. The centerpiece of my operation was Thunder, 800 pounds of pure muscle and championship bloodlines, with a temperament that didn't take kindly to uninvited guests. When strangers showed up where they didn't belong, Thunder always left them with unforgettable impressions. Everything changed 2 years ago when developers bought up the surrounding farmland and built Meadowbrook Estates. Cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns and residents who thought farming was something you only saw in movies. They formed a homeowners association and started making rules about acceptable neighborhood aesthetics. At first I didn't pay attention because my property predated their HOA by over a decade. Then Madison Hartwell moved in. At 40 years old, Madison was a real estate lawyer with perfectly styled blonde hair that looked like it stepped out of a salon, driving a custom pink ATV like some kind of oversized toy. Her outfit screamed Chanel meets Missouri mud, and her expression? Faker than a lawyer's billing statement. She saw Meadowbrook Estates as her personal kingdom, and intended to rule it with legal documents and HOA regulations wrapped around an iron fist. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I was checking my wheat crop. The stalks were knee-high and promising a fantastic harvest when I heard the distinctive whine of Madison's pink ATV approaching. She pulled up to my property line, killed the engine, and climbed off with the kind of theatrical confidence that lawyers perfect in courtrooms. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news while pretending to be friendly. "I'm Madison Hartwell, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could chat about your agricultural activities here." She gestured at my wheat field like it was some kind of neighborhood eyesore, instead of productive farmland that had been feeding families for over a decade. I walked over to meet her at the property line, keeping my voice neutral even though alarm bells were already going off in my head. "What kind of chat did you have in mind, Miss Hartwell?" Madison pulled out a thick folder and started flipping through pages like she was conducting a legal proceeding right there in my field. "We've had several complaints from residents about the aesthetic impact of your farming operation on our community's property values," she said without looking up from her papers. "The HOA board has determined that agricultural activities aren't in keeping with the residential character we're trying to maintain. We'd like to work with you to find a solution that benefits everyone." The way she emphasized solution made it clear she'd already decided what that solution should be. I felt my jaw tighten, but I'd learned patience in the military, and farming had taught me not to react impulsively. "Miss Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but my property was here long before your development existed. I bought this land 15 years ago, and I've been farming it legally and productively ever since. Your HOA doesn't have any jurisdiction over property that predates its formation." I crossed my arms and watched her reaction, curious to see how she'd respond to basic property law. Madison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Morrison, I think you'll find that community standards can be quite persuasive, regardless of technical legal precedents. We have ways of encouraging cooperation from residents who might be resistant to positive change." She closed her folder with a sharp snap and tucked it under her arm. "I do hope you'll consider working with us voluntarily. It would be so much easier for everyone involved." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Madison climbed back onto her pink ATV, started the engine with a loud roar, and drove off toward the housing development, leaving me standing in my wheat field with a growing sense that this conversation was just the opening move in a much larger game. As I watched her disappear into the maze of identical houses, I made a mental note to start documenting everything. Something told me I was going to need all the evidence I could gather. That evening, I walked out to Thunder's pasture and found him grazing near the fence line, closest to the housing development. He looked up when I approached, his massive head tilting slightly as if sensing my mood. "What do you think, big guy?" I said, scratching behind his ears. "Think we might have some uninvited visitors coming our way?" Thunder snorted and went back to his grass, but I could see the alertness in his posture. He'd always been good at reading situations, and he was already picking up on the tension in the air. Madison didn't waste time making good on her veiled threats. 3 days after our conversation, I found an official-looking document taped to my front door. The letterhead read, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, in fancy script, and the body was full of legal jargon about agricultural activity restrictions and community aesthetic violations. According to Madison's citation, my wheat field constituted a breach of neighborhood standards, and I had 14 days to remediate the situation or face escalating penalties. I called my lawyer, James Patterson, who'd handled the original purchase of my property. After I read him the citation over the phone, he was quiet for a long moment before letting out a low whistle. "Levi, they don't have a leg to stand on. Your land has papers, has protection from before they ever built a single house. Keep that citation for evidence, but don't let it worry you. They're trying to intimidate you with fake legal authority." That should have been the end of it, but Madison was just getting started. A week later, I was in my barn when I heard multiple engines coming from my wheat field. I grabbed binoculars and climbed to the loft window. What I saw made my blood pressure spike immediately. Madison was leading a convoy of 3 vehicles across my field, cutting a deliberate path through my carefully planted wheat rows like she owned the place. She was driving her pink ATV, wearing that windbreaker and pants like she was on some official inspection mission, while 3 men in matching gray uniforms followed behind on riding mowers. The uniforms looked official enough from a distance, with patches and badges that gave them the appearance of authority, but something felt wrong. Real law enforcement doesn't travel in formation across private property without warning, and they definitely don't bring landscaping equipment to serve legal documents. I watched in growing fury as Madison directed her fake security team to mow down a 2-acre section of my wheat crop. The men operated their machines with systematic precision, cutting down months of careful cultivation in neat, parallel lines. Madison rode her ATV along the edges of the destruction, occasionally stopping to take photos with her phone, like she was documenting some kind of successful military operation. 2 acres of wheat, bide-cut to stubble. I stood there frozen, like someone had slit my throat. This wasn't just about money, this was blood. This was an entire season I'd broken my back to plant and tend. The financial damage hit $3,000. But the psychological impact was worse. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a calculated attack designed to demonstrate Madison's power and my vulnerability. I called 911 as soon as the convoy finished their destruction and headed back toward the housing development. The dispatcher was professional, taking down my information and promising to send officers to investigate. But by the time Deputy Sheriff Martinez arrived 40 minutes later, Madison and her crew had vanished completely. The only evidence was freshly cut wheat stubble and tire tracks from the ATV leading back toward Meadowbrook Estate. Deputy Martinez was sympathetic but limited in what he could do without witnesses or clear evidence of who was responsible. "The tire tracks are circumstantial," he explained while taking photos. "And even if we could prove who did this, trespassing and property damage are misdemeanors that usually result in fines rather than jail time. You might have better luck in civil court, especially if you can establish a pattern of harassment." He handed me a case number and promised to file a report, but his expression suggested he'd seen this before. That night, I sat on my front porch with a beer and stared out at the ruined wheat field. The evening light made the damage look even worse, like a scar across the landscape I'd worked so hard to cultivate. Thunder was grazing nearby, occasionally lifting his head to look in my direction as if sensing my frustration. I found myself thinking about Madison's parting words from our first conversation, about community standards being quite persuasive regardless of legal precedents. The next morning brought another surprise. A certified letter from the county planning office. Councilman David Sterling had signed an emergency ordinance restricting agricultural activities in areas adjacent to residential developments. The ordinance was clearly written to target my operation specifically, using language about incompatible land uses and public safety concerns. The timing was suspicious enough to make me wonder about Madison's connections in local government. I called Jim Patterson again and read him the new ordinance. His reaction was immediate and profane. "This is corrupt as hell, Levi. Emergency ordinances are supposed to address immediate public safety threats, not resolve private property disputes. Someone with political connections is pulling strings behind the scenes. We need to challenge this in court, but it's going to take time and money." As I hung up the phone, I heard the familiar sound of Madison's ATV approaching. She was coming back for round 2, and this time she had even more confidence in her step. Madison's second assault came exactly 1 week after the first, and this time she brought heavier equipment and a bigger crew. I was repairing fence posts when I heard diesel engines rumbling through the morning mist. Through my binoculars, I could see Madison leading what looked more like a military operation than a neighborhood inspection. Her pink ATV was out front, followed by a pickup truck pulling a trailer loaded with industrial equipment and a small bulldozer. Instead of 3 fake security officers, she now had 6 men in gray uniforms with official-looking patches and badges. I grabbed my phone and started recording as they crossed onto my property without permission. Madison stood on a small hill like a field commander, behind her 6 soldiers in fake uniforms pulling a bulldozer like some kind of peacetime tank. She directed her crew with hand signals, orchestrating the systematic destruction of a 3-acre section of my best wheat. This time, they weren't just mowing. The crew used the bulldozer to scrape away topsoil in several areas, creating bare patches that would take years to restore. They dumped chemical solution from plastic containers, killing the roots and ensuring nothing would grow in those spots for months. Madison supervised from her ATV, occasionally taking photos and making notes like she was conducting an official environmental assessment. Thunder started making low rumbling sounds when the bulldozer roared to life near his fence line. I'd never seen him stomp his feet so hard. The ground under his hooves cracked in spiderweb patterns. His massive head was raised, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for the scent of the invaders. 800 pounds of pure muscle was getting more agitated by the minute, and I could see the tension building in his powerful shoulders. The financial damage from this second attack was devastating. 3 acres of premium wheat represented nearly $5,000 in lost revenue, plus the cost of soil restoration and replanting. But the psychological warfare was even more effective. Madison was demonstrating that she could strike whenever she wanted, with increasing levels of destruction, and there wasn't anything I could do through normal legal channels. I called the sheriff's department again, but this time the response was noticeably different. The dispatcher seemed less concerned, and when Deputy Martinez finally arrived 2 hours later, he spent more time asking about my farming permits than investigating the obvious vandalism. "Have you verified that your agricultural activities comply with the new county ordinance?" he asked, consulting a notebook that hadn't been there during his first visit. It became clear that Madison's political connections were already paying dividends. Someone had convinced local law enforcement that I was the problem, not the victim. Deputy Martinez took perfunctory photos but didn't bother following the tire tracks or asking for witness statements. His report would probably describe this as a property dispute rather than criminal vandalism. That afternoon, I received another certified letter from Madison's law office. The document was a formal final warning about my continued violations of HOA guidelines and county ordinances. According to her legal analysis, my wheat farming constituted a public nuisance, negatively impacting property values throughout Meadowbrook Estates. The letter demanded I cease all agricultural activities within 30 days or face legal action seeking $15,000 in damages plus court costs. The letter also included a generous offer to purchase my property at 30% below market value, with a 48-hour deadline for acceptance. Madison was following a classic intimidation playbook: create legal problems for the target, offer a below-market buyout as the solution, and use time pressure to prevent careful consideration. It was predatory behavior that real estate lawyers perfected when dealing with financially distressed property owners. I decided it was time to call Rick Pemberton. Rick lived 2 miles down the road and was a retired police detective who'd spent 30 years working fraud and corruption cases before moving to the country for a quieter life. He raised horses on his 20-acre spread and had always been supportive of my farming operation. More importantly, he had investigative skills and law enforcement connections that might help me figure out what Madison was really up to. Rick listened to my story over coffee, taking notes in a small notebook that reminded me of his detective days. "This sounds like a classic land grab scheme," he said when I finished. "Someone with money and political connections targets property they want, creates artificial legal problems for the current owner, then swoops in with a lowball purchase offer when the victim gets desperate. The question is, why your specific property is so valuable to her." That evening, I walked out to check on Thunder and found him standing at the fence line closest to the housing development, his massive head raised and nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Bulls have incredibly acute senses, and Thunder was picking up on something that had him agitated. I scratched behind his ears and tried to calm him down, but his attention remained focused on the direction where Madison's attacks had been coming from. He was a champion bull with protective instincts bred into his DNA, and every fiber of his being was telling him that his territory was under serious threat. Madison's third attack was the most vicious yet, coming just as my wheat was reaching peak growing season. I was in my workshop when I heard her pink ATV engine cutting through the morning quiet, but this time the sound was different, erratic revving and sudden stops that suggested reconnaissance before a main assault. I climbed to the workshop's second-story window and used binoculars to scan the wheat field. Madison was alone, wearing her usual windbreaker and pants, slowly circling my largest uncut section like a predator studying prey. She had a backpack slung over her shoulders and was stopping periodically to dismount and examine the soil around my wheat plants. After 20 minutes of this suspicious behavior, she drove back toward the housing development without taking obvious action. 2 hours later, she returned with her full crew and industrial equipment. But this time, they weren't just cutting wheat. I watched in horror as they systematically poisoned my soil with chemical herbicide that killed everything on contact. The liquid turned my green wheat brown within minutes, creating expanding circles of dead vegetation that would contaminate the earth for months or years. Madison supervised from her ATV, directing her crew to focus on areas where my wheat was most mature and valuable. They worked with methodical efficiency, dumping chemicals and using the bulldozer to scrape away contaminated topsoil into mounds that looked like burial cairns, scattered across my ruined field. By the time they finished, I had lost nearly my entire crop, approximately $25,000 worth of wheat, plus long-term damage to my soil's productivity. This wasn't just property damage anymore. It was ecological warfare, designed to make my land unusable for farming. I looked up at the sky, my hands covered in mud. But this wasn't farmer's dirt. This was the filth Madison had thrown directly at my life. She didn't just want my land, she wanted my soul to be sold at discount prices. The psychological impact was devastating. Madison was forcing me to choose between accepting her lowball purchase offer or watching my livelihood slowly die from chemical contamination. Within an hour, I received a text from an unknown number, with photos of the destruction and a simple message. 48 hours to accept our generous offer. After that, the price goes down. Madison wasn't pretending to follow legal procedures anymore. She was operating like a criminal organization, using intimidation and extortion to force a property sale she couldn't accomplish through legitimate means. I called Rick immediately and asked him to document the damage and help me figure out next steps. When he arrived and saw the extent of destruction, his face went hard, with the kind of anger that comes from 30 years of seeing criminals victimize innocent people. "This is beyond harassment, Levi," he said, taking photos of the chemical burns. "This is environmental terrorism, and they're not even trying to hide it because they think they have complete legal immunity." Rick had spent the past week investigating Madison's background and business connections. What he'd found was disturbing. "She's been running this same scheme in 3 other counties over the past 5 years, he explained. She identifies farmland ripe for development, creates legal problems for current owners, then buys properties at below market prices before flipping them to developers for massive profits. She's made millions by essentially stealing family farms." The corruption went deeper than Madison's individual scheme. Rick had discovered that Councilman Sterling had received significant campaign contributions from Madison's real estate company and had voted on at least 6 ordinances that directly benefited her business interests. "She's not just buying properties," Rick said. "She's buying politicians and using government power to eliminate legal resistance to her schemes." Thunder walked in circles around his pen, tongue licking his lips, eyes fixed on Meadowbrook Estates. He knew. Somehow he knew the enemy was about to take one more step. Bulls don't just react to immediate threats. They remember patterns and prepare for future challenges. Thunder had been watching Madison's attacks with growing agitation, and his protective instincts were telling him that more violence was coming. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at Madison's purchase offer and trying to decide whether I had the strength to keep fighting. The financial pressure was enormous, and the legal system seemed completely corrupted in her favor. My wheat crop was destroyed, my soil was contaminated, and my ability to make a living from farming had been systematically eliminated. Taking her offer would mean losing my dream, but continuing to resist might mean losing everything I'd worked for over 15 years. I walked out to Thunder's pasture and found him standing near the fence, staring toward the housing development with focused intensity that made his breeding valuable. "What do you think, big guy?" I said, scratching behind his ears. "Think it's time to show these people what happens when they push too far?" Thunder turned to look at me with those intelligent dark eyes, then snorted and pawed the ground with one massive hoof. He was ready for action, and suddenly I realized that Madison's arrogance might have given me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on her entire operation. Rick and I spent the next week setting up surveillance equipment and gathering evidence of Madison's criminal activities. Rick's detective background proved invaluable as he taught me how to position cameras for maximum coverage and document illegal activity in ways that would hold up in court. We installed motion-activated recording devices along property lines where Madison's crew had been entering my land, and Rick used his law enforcement connections to run background checks on the fake security officers. What we discovered was worse than suspected. The men in gray uniforms weren't licensed security guards or county employees. They were day laborers Madison had hired from construction sites and equipped with fake badges and official-looking patches. She was running a completely fraudulent operation, using criminal impersonation and trespassing to intimidate property owners into accepting low-ball purchase offers. The evidence would be enough to send her to prison for multiple felonies. But Rick suggested waiting for one more attack before involving law enforcement. Madison thinks she's winning this war, he explained. Her arrogance is making her careless, and next time she comes onto your property, we'll be ready to document everything and turn the tables completely. Sometimes the best way to catch a criminal is to let them commit their crimes while you're recording every detail. I agreed to the plan, but I also decided to add my own twist. Thunder had been getting more agitated with each attack, and his protective instincts were reaching a breaking point. Bulls are territorial animals with long memories, and Thunder had identified Madison and her crew as threats to his domain. If I could time things just right, his natural behavior might provide the perfect demonstration of what happens when criminals face real consequences. The opportunity came 3 days later, when Madison launched her most brazen attack yet. This time, she didn't bother with any pretense of legal authority. She and her 6 fake security officers drove directly onto my property at dawn, unloaded their equipment, and began systematically destroying what remained of my wheat crop. Madison rode her pink ATV in circles around the destruction, taking photos and videos like she was documenting a victory celebration. From my position in the barn loft, I could see Madison's crew working with aggressive efficiency, using chainsaws to cut down fence posts and spreading more chemical herbicide on any vegetation that had survived previous attacks. They were operating like a military unit, conducting scorched earth warfare, determined to make my land completely unusable for farming. Madison was clearly planning to make this her final assault before forcing me to accept her purchase offer. But Madison had made one critical mistake in her tactical planning. In her arrogance and overconfidence, she had forgotten about Thunder. The prize bull had been watching these attacks for weeks, and each intrusion had increased his territorial aggression. Bulls don't forgive or forget when their domain is threatened, and Thunder had been preparing for the moment when he could defend his territory against the invaders. I waited until Madison and her crew were fully committed to their destruction, with all equipment deployed and escape routes blocked by their own vehicles. Then I walked casually toward Thunder's pasture, making sure surveillance cameras would capture my movements clearly. The gate had a simple latch that could be opened easily, and Thunder himself was standing near the fence, watching Madison's ATV with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey. "Looks like we have uninvited guests again, Thunder," I said loudly enough for cameras to pick up my voice. "I guess I better check on the other animals and make sure everyone's secure." Then I deliberately fumbled with the gate latch, making it appear accidental when the gate swung open and Thunder stepped out into the open field. What happened next was 800 pounds of pure bull rage unleashing 15 years of protective instincts. Each hoofbeat sounded like thunder drums, echoing across the battlefield. The ground shook. Madison turned around. Her eyes went wide as dinner plates. She didn't even have time to scream before 800 pounds of red meat had charged toward her like a bovine hurricane. Thunder spotted Madison's pink ATV immediately and charged with the kind of speed and power that made him a champion. The panic was immediate and absolute. Madison screamed and gunned her ATV engine, trying to outrun a bull that could cover ground faster than most people could drive. Thunder pursued her with single-minded determination, his massive hooves thundering against the earth as he chased the pink vehicle in wide circles around my ruined wheat field. Madison's fake security officers abandoned their equipment and ran toward their trucks, but Thunder was faster and more agile than they expected. Madison made the mistake of trying to jump off her ATV while it was still moving, tumbling into a muddy irrigation ditch and ruining her windbreaker with brown water and decomposing plant matter. Thunder immediately turned his attention to the abandoned pink ATV, which he apparently considered some kind of mechanical threat to his territory. He lowered his massive head and charged the vehicle with all his considerable strength, flipping it completely over and then trampling it until the frame was bent beyond recognition. Thunder didn't just flip the ATV, he came back around, stomped on the pink HOA symbol printed on the vehicle's frame. Like a declaration, this is my land. The fake security officers made it to their trucks and began a hasty retreat, but Thunder wasn't finished with his territorial defense. He chased their convoy across my property and down the access road, his powerful legs easily keeping pace with their vehicles as they fled toward the safety of the housing development. Madison was left behind in the irrigation ditch, covered in mud and screaming threats about lawsuits and criminal charges that everyone knew she would never be able to file. I walked over to where she was struggling to climb out and offered her a hand up, maintaining the appearance of someone genuinely concerned about an unfortunate accident. "Are you okay, Ms. Hartwell?" I asked with perfect innocence. I can't imagine how Thunder got out of his pasture. He's usually so well behaved around visitors. The whole incident had taken less than 20 minutes, but it represented a complete reversal of power in our ongoing conflict. Madison had gone from being an untouchable predator to being a muddy criminal caught on camera committing multiple felonies. And Thunder had demonstrated that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to show them what happens when they pick on someone who can fight back with 800 pounds of championship muscle and attitude. Madison's threats of legal action came faster than expected, but they also provided exactly the opportunity Rick and I had been hoping for. Within 24 hours of Thunder's rampage, I received a certified letter from Madison's law office demanding that I surrender my dangerous animal to county authorities and pay damages for her destroyed ATV, plus medical expenses for her traumatic injuries. The letter also threatened criminal charges for assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment of public safety. But Madison's eagerness to file charges had blinded her to the legal trap she was walking into. By claiming victim status and demanding police investigation, she was inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny that would expose her entire criminal operation. Rick had contacts throughout the county sheriff's department, and he made sure Detective Sarah Chen, an honest cop with a reputation for thorough investigation, was assigned to Madison's complaint. Detective Chen arrived at my property the next morning with a professional demeanor and a thick case file that suggested she'd already done considerable background research. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've been having ongoing disputes with Ms. Hartwell in the Meadowbrook Estates HOA," she said, setting up a digital recorder on my kitchen table. "I'd like to hear your side of the story, starting from the beginning, and I'd appreciate if you could walk me through everything step by step." I had never thought I would have to prove my right to farm on the land I had cleared myself. As I presented each video segment, each document that Madison had abused, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because this was the first time someone was actually listening. "Detective Chen," I said, settling into my chair, "Madison Hartwell has been running a systematic harassment campaign designed to force me off my land so she can buy it below market value. I've got documentation of every attack, every illegal trespass, every piece of equipment they've used to destroy my crops." I walked her through the entire timeline, providing documentation for every attack and showing her the surveillance footage we'd captured. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The recordings clearly showed Madison and her fake security team trespassing on my property, destroying my crops, poisoning my soil, and impersonating law enforcement officers. Detective Chen sat in silence, taking notes like a careful judge. But when we reached the part where Madison declared my land a public nuisance, her eyes turned cold. "This is no longer a civil dispute, Mr. Morrison. This is organized crime." Detective Chen's expression grew more serious with each piece of evidence I presented. "Mr. Morrison, what I'm seeing here constitutes multiple felonies, including criminal trespass, vandalism, environmental crimes, and impersonation of law enforcement officers. The incident with your bull appears to be a natural consequence of Miss Hartwell's illegal presence on your property. In fact, you would be within your rights to file charges against her for the property damage and financial losses you've suffered." Rick had been busy during the week following Thunder's revenge, and he'd discovered something even more damaging than Madison's individual crimes. His investigation into her business practices had uncovered evidence of a systematic corruption scheme involving Councilman David Sterling and at least 2 other local politicians. Madison had been paying bribes disguised as campaign contributions in exchange for ordinances and zoning changes that supported her land acquisition schemes. "Rick, tell Detective Chen what you found about the financial connections," I said, gesturing toward my neighbor who was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder full of documents. Rick opened his folder and spread out bank records, campaign contribution reports, and copies of ordinances that Sterling had signed. "Detective Chen, Madison has been paying bribes for 5 years in exchange for favorable legislation. The emergency ordinance targeting Levi's farm was enacted 3 days after Sterling received a $10,000 campaign contribution from Madison's real estate company. Detective Chen was particularly interested in the emergency ordinance that Sterling had signed, restricting agricultural activities in residential areas. This ordinance was passed without proper public notice or environmental impact assessment, she explained. If we can prove it was enacted in exchange for bribes, we can have it invalidated and pursue federal corruption charges against everyone involved. This is starting to look like a racketeering case that might interest the FBI. The investigation moved quickly once Detective Chin had all the evidence. Within a week, she had obtained search warrants for Madison's law office and real estate company, plus subpoenas for Sterling's financial records and campaign contributions. The evidence of corruption was so extensive that the FBI became involved, treating the case as a federal racketeering investigation under organized crime statutes. Madison must have realized her legal situation was deteriorating rapidly, because she made one final, desperate attempt to salvage her scheme. She called a meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board and proposed an emergency resolution to have my property condemned as a public nuisance under eminent domain laws. The resolution would have allowed the county to seize my land and sell it to developers for community improvement purposes. But Rick had been monitoring Madison's communications through his law enforcement contacts, and he made sure Detective Chen was present at the HOA meeting with recording equipment and federal marshals standing by. The meeting turned into a complete disaster for Madison as she accidentally revealed details about her bribery scheme while trying to pressure the HOA board into supporting her condemnation resolution. Councilman Sterling assured me that the eminent domain process would be expedited once the agricultural restriction ordinance was in place, Madison said, apparently forgetting that her words were being recorded for potential use in federal court. The campaign contributions we've made should guarantee cooperation from the county planning office and the zoning board. We've invested too much money in this project to let one stubborn farmer derail our entire development plan. She continued talking for several more minutes, providing enough incriminating evidence to support conspiracy charges against her entire organization. Detective Chen arrested Madison at the end of the HOA meeting, charging her with multiple felonies including bribery, conspiracy, environmental crimes, and racketeering. Councilman Sterling was arrested the same evening at his home, and 2 other local politicians were taken into custody the following morning. The scope of the corruption scandal dominated local news for weeks, exposing a systematic scheme to steal family farms and enrich politically connected real estate developers. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once federal prosecutors became involved, and Madison's fake security officers cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, providing testimony about her instructions to trespass on my property and destroy my crops. As I watched the news coverage that evening, sitting on my front porch with thunder grazing peacefully in the background, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not just for my own situation, but for every farmer who had been bullied by corrupt developers and politicians. Thunder looked up from his grass and snorted softly, as if he understood that justice was finally beginning to work the way it was supposed to. The months following Madison's arrest brought a sense of peace, and vindication that I hadn't felt since before this nightmare began. My wheat fields were slowly recovering from the chemical damage, and I had used part of Madison's restitution payment to hire soil restoration specialists who guaranteed my land would be more productive than ever within 2 growing seasons. Thunder had become something of a local celebrity, with neighbors stopping by regularly to bring him treats and take pictures with the bull who had brought down a corrupt land-grabbing scheme. Within 3 months, Madison had pled guilty to multiple felonies and been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, plus restitution of $50,000 for damage to my property. Sterling received a 7-year sentence for public corruption and was banned from holding elected office for life. Madison's real estate company was dissolved, and her personal assets were seized to pay damages to the farmers she had victimized across 3 counties. But the most satisfying part of Madison's downfall was still to come. As part of federal asset forfeiture proceedings, Madison's personal property was being auctioned to pay restitution to her victims. This included her house in Meadowbrook Estates, which had been built on land she had acquired through her fraudulent scheme. The irony was perfect. The woman who had tried to steal my farm was now losing her own home to pay for the crimes she had committed. Rick suggested I attend the auction, partly to see justice being served, and partly because Madison's house might be available for an attractive price. "Think about it, Levi," he said with a grin. "You could buy her house for probably 40% of its market value, just like she tried to do with your farm. Sometimes the best revenge is turning the tables completely and using their own tactics against them." The auction was held on a crisp autumn morning in the county courthouse, with about 30 potential buyers examining property listings and financial documents. Madison's house was a 4-bedroom colonial with 2 acres of landscaped grounds, worth approximately $300,000 under normal market conditions. But the forced sale conditions and the property's association with a federal corruption scandal had scared away most serious bidders. I registered for the auction and took a seat in the back of the room, curious to see how low the bidding would go. The auctioneer described the property's features and legal status, noting that the sale was being conducted under federal asset forfeiture laws and that proceeds would go toward victim restitution. When bidding opened at $100,000, only 3 people raised their hands. The competition was limited and half-hearted, with most bidders dropping out quickly as the price climbed above $150,000. I waited until the bidding stalled at $180,000 before raising my hand for the first time. The auctioneer recognized my bid and asked if anyone wanted to counter-offer. When nobody responded, he counted down from 10 and declared me the winning bidder at $180,000, exactly 40% of the property's appraised value. The financial irony was perfect and deeply satisfying. Madison had tried to force me to sell my farm for 30% below market value, but now I was buying her house for 40% below market value, using the restitution money she had been forced to pay me. The woman who had spent months trying to destroy my livelihood had ended up financing my expansion into real estate investment. I decided to rent Madison's former house to a young family from the city who wanted to experience rural life without the commitment of buying property. The rental income provided steady revenue that supplemented my farming operation, and the tenants were delighted to have Thunder as their neighbor. Their children loved feeding him carrots and apples, and Thunder seemed to enjoy the attention from visitors who appreciated his heroic role in exposing the corruption scheme. The Meadowbrook Estates community underwent dramatic transformation once Madison's influence was removed. The new HOA board was elected democratically and focused on maintaining property values through reasonable standards rather than aggressive legal harassment. Several neighbors apologized to me for not speaking up sooner about Madison's behavior, and many expressed interest in supporting local agriculture by buying produce directly from area farms. The federal investigation also led to broader reforms in county government that prevented future corruption schemes. New transparency requirements made it impossible for developers to buy influence through disguised campaign contributions, and zoning decisions now required extensive public input and environmental impact assessments. The reforms were nicknamed the Thunder Laws by local media, in honor of the bull whose intervention had exposed the entire scandal. Detective Chen received a commendation from the FBI for her thorough investigation, and Rick was offered a consulting position with the county sheriff's department to help train deputies in recognizing and investigating organized crime activities. The success of our case became a model for other rural communities dealing with predatory development schemes and corrupt local officials. The following spring, the county organized a dedication ceremony for a statue of Thunder placed right in the central town square. 800 pounds of red bronze cast in the shape of the bull trampling an HOA symbol under his hooves. Children took pictures, adults placed flowers. Everyone knew that today's justice was thanks to a bull who knew how to stand up. The inscription read, "Sometimes justice has 4 legs and weighs 800 pounds. Local artists had captured the moment of his charge perfectly, showing him in all his magnificent fury, defending the land that belonged to honest farmers. Thunder got painted on the county courthouse wall, protector of the land. Under his hooves was a crushed HOA seal. Everyone stopped to take pictures. The mural showed him in all his 800-pound glory, standing guard over golden wheat fields with Meadowbrook Estates visible in the background. A reminder that corruption could be defeated when good people and reliable bulls worked together. On quiet evenings, I liked to sit on my front porch and look out over my restored wheat fields while Thunder grazed peacefully in his pasture. The land was more beautiful and productive than ever, and the community around me was stronger and more honest, thanks to the events that had started with Madison's arrogant attempt to steal my farm. Sometimes justice takes time to arrive, but when it finally comes, it's worth the wait. The story had one final twist that perfectly captured the poetic justice of Madison's downfall. As part of her plea agreement, she was required to perform 200 hours of community service after her release from federal prison. The judge assigned her to work with a local agricultural nonprofit that helped beginning farmers learn sustainable farming techniques. Madison would spend her community service hours learning about the very agricultural activities she had spent years trying to eliminate from her community. Rick and I laughed about that detail over coffee one morning as we watched Thunder chase a butterfly around his pasture with the kind of playful energy that showed he was completely at peace with his territory. "You know, Levi," Rick said, "I think Thunder knew exactly what he was doing when he went after that pink ATV. Bulls have a pretty good sense of justice, and sometimes they're better at enforcing it than the legal system." That evening, I sat next to Thunder in the twilight, wind rustling through the wheat fields that had turned green again. I placed my hand on his back and whispered softly, "We didn't just keep the land, we kept justice alive." He rumbled quietly, as if he understood. I raised my coffee mug in a toast to Thunder, who looked up from his butterfly chase and snorted his approval. "Here's to standing your ground and fighting back when someone tries to take what's yours," I said. "And here's to having good neighbors and reliable bulls when the fighting gets tough." The morning sun was warming the restored wheat fields, and everything was exactly as it should be. Madison Hartwell had learned the hard way that some people aren't willing to be intimidated, and some bulls never forget when their territory has been threatened. Justice had been served with interest, and Thunder was the unlikely hero who had made it all possible.